Hi, my name is Luulu, and I am into a lot of different fandoms. I like anime, I like reading sci-fi fantasy, I like all kinds of nerdy stuff, and more than that, I like to talk about it. I also like to craft. So for the next little while, sit back, hang out, and craft along with me while I go over whatever it is that I'm currently into.
Hello, and welcome back again to another episode of this week's Craft and Chat. We are now on episode 6. Isn't that wild? We're going to start off with a few announcements. I am Luulu. I am your host. The announcements are all going to involve the knitting, of course. We are almost halfway done with this. Super exciting. I have loved this project from start to finish. I plan on knitting it again. I would love to see how this works up in a variegated yarn. But I'm hoping to be done with this cowl by the end of next episode, which means after that will be that time lapse I've been promising you guys. And with it, I'm going to do my next pattern a little bit differently than I did this one. Going in the future, at least as of right now, what we're going to be doing is I will at least start a project on the YouTube channel. You will get to see me start it. I will obviously be working on it while I'm talking to you guys, but I will also be working on it in between videos. So you might see massive jumps in the project, or you might even see changes in projects. The project might honestly change depending on what I want to talk about. But as always, when I finish the project, there will be a time lapse of whatever it is that I made that shows up on the video with a voiceover of what I thought about it. I think this might give me a little bit more freedom to knit when I desire to knit and show a little bit more progress instead of just, oh, hey, look, guys, we did like half an inch. I don't know. If you have a preference, please let me know. But as always, this is a cowl. I got it right this time. It's a cowl created by Inked Empress Fiber Arts. And the yarn I'm using is the Footsie fingering weight in the Stoker colorway by Voolenvine Yarns. As always, both links to both of these companies will be in the description below. And that is all for our announcements. So we're going to move on to the nerdiness of this week. Today we are going to be talking about a literary short story called The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. It is maybe a 20-minute read. I first learned about it when I was in college. I was taking a creative writing class, and it was presented to me as, this is the type of book, type of story that almost everybody has read. That was wrong. I know a lot of people who haven't read it. So if you have read it, you'll recognize a lot of what I'm going over in this story. If you have not read it, spoiler warnings. You should read it anyway, but you can also hey, I read this story, so you don't have to, but no, really read the story. In fact, I would love it for people who have read the story and people who may read the story to share your thoughts with whether you think I'm right, whether you think I'm wrong, whether you think I'm, you know, tell me what you think. I would love to start a conversation about this because I don't know, I just think it's interesting. For the people that have not read the story, or maybe you don't remember it very well, it is about this woman. She is an unnamed narrator, and she is ill, but her husband, who is a physician, considers it to be temporary nervous depression with a slight hysterical tendency. So he ships her off to the country 3 miles away, which is a far cry when you know cart and buggies, not very many cars. It's far away. Ships her off to the country with him 3 months, and she kind of just doesn't do anything. She sneaks time to write. Her husband does not like it that she is writing because it tires her, and she admits several times that it is indeed tiring. But every time she admits it, it's because she has to hide it, but I digress. As she is experiencing these 3 months in the countryside, she becomes more and more interested in the wallpaper of the room with which she is staying. Originally, I thought she was completely confined to this room. Over my most latest reread, it doesn't seem to be the case. She is allowed to leave that room and wander around other areas of the house. but she gets tired so easily, and she spends a lot of time in this room. Throughout the story, she goes from being very competent, almost sounding, but still unreliable, which I'll get to in a minute, to by the end of the story, she is disheveled, she is all over the place, she doesn't make a lot of sense. A lot of people like to consider it that she has gone insane. And the big question the, that a lot of people ask is why? Why does she end up acting the way that she does? And depending on how you want to answer this question, changes the tone of the story. I'm going to start off with what is least represented in it, and that is the concept that this is actually a supernatural horror short fiction, and the reason why. So she's up here and she's in this attic room, right? And she's looking around and she's looking at this wallpaper, and this wallpaper is so ugly. But at one point it was a nursery, and then it became a gymnasium for children, boys. She guesses. I'm not sure why she guesses boys, but she does. And throughout this room, there are things that don't bother her that much, which is the scratch marks all over the floors, the um, holes that have landed in them, how the boys have torn apart this room and tried to take down the wallpaper. And it just, the way she describes it, I can just imagine these children trying desperately to get out of this room. I would love to actually look into some history of around this time period to see if there are any accounts of children who have been captured or held without being allowed outside for whatever reason, to see if that holds up or not. But she also mentions that her bed, right, is bolted to the floor. Why would you bolt a bed to the floor? Why were all of these children trying so desperately to get out of this room? And as the story goes on, you learn like more and more really creepy things. Like she starts noticing that something underneath the wallpaper is moving. And at first only she can see it, but then she notices the two others in her household also paying attention to the wallpaper. And as she deteriorates and the story goes on, she gets more and more desperate to figure out what's behind the wallpaper until she is the one that is ripping down all of this wallpaper. And then there's this shift in her psyche where she goes from being the woman trying to rescue what she calls the creeping woman behind the wallpaper to being the woman behind the wallpaper. She starts referring to herself as having finally gotten out of the wallpaper and she's not going back in. And at one point she locks herself in the room. Her husband gets the key, opens the door, and he sees the room, faints, and then she steps over him, and that's the end of the story. If we're looking at this from a horror point of view, I can definitely see like not just her ripping down the wallpaper, but also her like, I don't know, clinging, shimmying across the wall with like maybe a crazy look on her face. Maybe she's hanging on to the rings that are supposed to be jutting outside of the wall. That's another thing. There are these rings that are attached to the wall, which is part of the reason she thinks it's a gymnasium, but might also support a children in captivity kind of a thing, or captivity in general. But, I mean, that's where a lot of people go, huh, this could be supernatural horror, which is kind of cool. More often, though, you'll see this story analyzed as a piece of first wave feminism. And there's a lot more to support that here. We're going to rewind a little bit. Remember when I mentioned that she is ill and her physician husband decides that it's just a mere nervous depression, blah, 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 blah. Okay, So she mentions at one point that she has a baby, but she's not taking care of the baby. She's too nervous to be around the baby. But this other woman called Mary is taking care of the baby. This gives off the impression that our narrator had postpartum depression, which would explain her suddenly having symptoms of nervousness, depression. Like it's a very serious thing that happens to some women that even now goes unchecked. So back then it was considered something that didn't even exist. And the cure for this, that a lot of renowned physicians, was basically get plenty of bed rest and fresh air. And so they do, for 3 months. Now, once she's in this room, she says stuff all the time, and it is so difficult to read at points, because she says things like, "Oh, I hate this room. I really wanted one of the rooms downstairs because they're oh so pretty, but but John wouldn't like that. He says there isn't enough room for 2 beds down there, and, well, what would he do if he wanted to take another? He's so careful in how he loves me." Bullshit. And this keeps going. Like, she will start to almost, it feels like, think for herself, in the sense of like, hey, I don't think this is helping me. I think being around people would help me. I think talking about my writing would help me. I think writing would help me. But every time she follows that right on up with, "But John doesn't think it's a good idea, and he's so smart and so wise." And at 1, maybe 2 points in the story, her husband actually refers to her as little girl. There's gaslighting, there's misogyny, there is just an infuriating amount of how he treats her alone while promising to love her on its own can drive someone to do some crazy things, on top of the fact that she likely has postpartum depression, on top of the fact that she is pretty much being contained inside of a house for 3 months. She doesn't have much to do. As she goes along the story, she becomes tired more and more often. She's sleeping during the day due to the depression. She's awake at night, all night, just staring at the wallpaper, and just the mixture of the confinement and then the depression and the belittling is slowly what gets inside of her skin. And if I remember right, I've even seen some theories that John doesn't actually faint when he comes into the room. It's theorized that maybe she somehow kills him and then steps over his dead body. I haven't found anything in the short story itself to support that, but it would be interesting, and honestly, it would make a lot of sense. However, there's also a third option to how she deteriorates the way she does. And the clues come in small bits. So she mentions, as I've said before, that she hates this wallpaper, right, guys? She hates it. She hates the pattern. And she knows a little bit about interior decorating. She also mentions that around, I want to say it's her second writing entry, so 2 weeks in, she's begun to notice that there is a second pattern underneath the first. And it's a dark pattern that's very hard to see, and it doesn't make any sense. It just goes off in different directions and forms and blobs, and this second pattern is what eventually takes the shape of the woman that seems to be behind the yellow wallpaper. She also mentions that later on in the story that there is a smell that has been in the room, that it's less noticeable during the day because all the windows are open for her to get plenty of fresh air. But at night, the smell is much more apparent. And eventually, even during the day when the windows are open, the smell is still there. And then remember, we've got all of those, the other hints from other people having been in this room and trying to have gotten out of this room or destroyed this room in a children will be children kind of sense, whatever. I think there is black mold growing within the walls of the room that she's staying in. The symptoms of black mold are fatigue, brain fog, focus and concentration issues, confusion, disorientation, mood swings, appetite swings, insomnia, and hallucinations. We know she suffers fatigue because she mentions multiple different times throughout the story that she just gets so tired. Everything makes her so tired, and she gets tired more and more often as the story progresses. I also think that she has memory issues and brain fog because early on in the story, she mentions this woman named Mary who is supposedly taking care of the baby. She mentions the baby once more after this and then seems to completely forget that her child exists. After that, Mary is only ever mentioned once. Now, at first, it is assumed that perhaps it's John's sister, because John's sister shows up in the story as a housekeeper, the wonderful housekeeper, and is only referred to as the sister for that passage. But then when it comes into play again, suddenly the sister has a name, Jenny. So what happened to Mary? She never mentions Mary again. I think what is going on is Mary is the name of John's sister. And then she forgot, with the contamination from the mold and the depression and the postpartum depression, she forgot Mary's name and could only refer to her as the sister. But that didn't vibe well with her. She's an intellect. She's a writer. She doesn't like things being unnamed. So she gave John's sister the name Jenny because Jenny is close to John, easier to remember, more helpful with the brain fog. As she goes on, she mentions that she's writing less and less. She's having less time to do it because she's tired more and more. She mentions there's a conversation between her and John at one point where he's like, oh, look, you're eating so much better now. And by the way, guys, she's eating red meat and drinking wine. So she's also inebriated throughout a lot of this. But she does mention that she only seems to eat when he's around. When he's not around, she eats almost nothing, which gives off the impression that perhaps she's having mood swing or appetite swings. I mentioned mood swings because she also mentions that she is crying during most of the day, but not when John's around. Mood swings or hiding just how bad it gets. And then, of course, the more she sees this creeping lady, the stronger it hints towards hallucinations. So my theory is that this woman did have postpartum depression from the birth of her child. It was not taken seriously. She was transported to the countryside away from, honestly, everything that could have helped her, kept in captivity, and exposed continuously to toxic mold. And I think that is why her mindset deteriorates the way it does throughout the story. And now you may be asking, but John and Mary Jenny doesn't seem to be affected at all. You're right. Sort of. One, toxic mold does not affect everybody the same way. Two, Jenny is seen interacting with the wallpaper and mentioning that it has gotten all over the main character and John's clothing. John is almost never in the house. He's always in town. He's a physician. He's a reputable physician. So he's always off away on important cases. You know, neglecting his wife as often as possible and potentially taking all these others in other beds. He hasn't spent enough time to be exposed to the black mold enough for his mindset to deteriorate in the same way that our main narrator's mind has. And that is my current theory. What do you think? Did you like it? Did you hate it? It's okay if you hated it. It's okay if you don't agree. It's cool if you do agree, but I don't know, it might even be more interesting if you don't. Have you read the Yellow Wallpaper? am I reading too much into this story? Like, or was it just, you know, a short story? And that's it. Because sometimes, you know, it's just a short story. I don't think it is in this case. I think this is a woman's way of dealing with her frustrations on how the medical industry was treating females at the time that the story was written. Because sometimes that's the only way you can get information out into the world. Whatever the truth is, we'll never know. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. I think we are about out of time. And yeah. Please have a wonderful week. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.